The next topic that we're going to go to is the biophysics of fluid flow. So essentially, this is fluid dynamics. But because this is a biophysics course, we want to apply fluid dynamics to something that exists in a living system. So the first thing that most individuals would think of in terms of fluid flow would be blood flow in your circulatory system. So this whole lecture is about the basics of fluid flow so that we have the foundations to be able to do some calculations, and then we'll take a look at hemodynamics, which is the biophysics of fluid flow. So in today's lecture, we're going to go through a recap of biodynamics, basically the three different types of motion we talk so much about, locomotion on land, in water, and in air. Next, we're going to go through fluid flow. So there are a few discussions we have to have about fluid flow before we actually get into applying it towards a biological system. So first, just being familiar with the terms. So I'm going to go through an overview of fluid flow terms or fluid dynamic terms. That would include what a Newtonian fluid is versus a non-Newtonian fluid, as well as what types of fluid flow there are. There would be laminar flow, which is steady and smooth, and there's turbulent flow, which is chaotic. And then I'm going to go through something called a velocity profile, which defines what kind of speed your fluid is going at different areas within a tube or a pipe. After that, once we're familiar with those terms, we want to go through some mathematical foundations of fluid flow. So that would include Poisseuille's formula and the continuity equation. That'll allow you to calculate quite a few things based off of cylindrical pipe models of fluid flow. Then we'll take a look at some analogies we can make between fluid flow equations and some other physics concepts. So we're going to take a look at flow network, energetics, as well as Bernoulli's equation. Last but not least, once we have all of that knowledge at the back of our heads, we'll be able to move forward to hemodynamics, which is the study of the dynamics of blood flow, which I've always thought was very cool. So in terms of starting off, we do have to go through the circulatory system. You don't have to know that much detail about the circulatory system, just the basics. And you'll also have to know about the composition of blood. So once we know what blood is made of, as well as what the circulatory system is like, we'll then be able to apply some of the models that we presented in the mathematical foundations section and start to do some calculations. But the truth is, no matter what you do, if you present a model for something that is in real life, it may not always be accurate. So we also have to familiarize ourselves with different types of effects that could affect blood flow in real life. So that would be the Fahraeus-Lindqvist effect, as well as plasma skimming. Those two I'll go through in a little bit of detail. And then afterwards, I'll go through some pressure flow relations. So why don't we start off with the recap? First, I'm going to go through just the equations that I'd want you to know for kinematics and energy. Afterwards, we're just going to do a quick recap of the different concepts we learned for locomotion on land, in air, and in water. So for kinematics equations and energy, we were presented with 5 kinematics equations, and primarily you would use both of these for projectile motion. So these would be the foundations or the mathematical foundations you would need in order to proceed with calculating or trying to solve a problem related to projectile motion. And there are 2 ways to solve for it. Number one, you can use kinematics equations if you break down your 2D motion into its x and y components. So once you've broken it down into its x and y components, you can apply your kinematics equations to each direction and be able to calculate different terms that you can use to solve for your solve for whatever variable you're looking for. If there's not enough information presented to you to apply the kinematics equations, then you can take a look at energy. So in terms of energy, what we can apply is the law of conservation of energy, So that means the total amount of energy that you start with is equal to the total amount of mechanical energy that you end up with. So that's just 2 snapshots in time, and we call that MEI and MEF. So with MEI, that would be the total mechanical energy of the initial state, and that is made up of initial kinetic energy plus initial potential energy. So kinetic energy is defined by motion or velocity, so you have 1/2 mv squared. And then you have gravitational potential energy defined as mgh. So then you would have a certain amount of energy at the beginning, a certain amount of energy at the end, and you'll be able to solve for one of the missing variables. The examples that we looked at afterwards, or the applications, were pretty much where can we find biodynamics? And because biodynamics is the physics of motion, the only types of motion that we can have on land would be walking, running, jumping, and propelling. So those are the 3 main types of motion that you could have. We kind of group in walking and running together because it's just a matter of a change in velocity. So with each of these different types of locomotion, we're presented with different types of friction forces, because every time you're trying to move, there has to be something that's opposing your movement. So in terms of locomotion on land, we're just looking at frictional force. So that means if I take a look here, this diagram has my intended motion. So the box is intending to move towards the right. It has some sort of weight, or mg, that's pushing onto the object, and the object has a certain coefficient of friction, or mu. This object will also receive a pushback force from the bottom box, and that's called the normal force. So then when you have the coefficient of friction as well as the normal force, you're able to calculate the magnitude of your friction force. So that is equal, your friction force is equal to mu times n. And the important thing to note about friction is that it will always try and oppose the direction of intended motion. So if I want to move towards the right here, then your friction force is going to point towards the left. And so in that case, we'll have to use a similar free body diagram for all of our cases of walking, jumping, and propelling. So for walking, the take-home message from walking is that your forward thrust comes from friction. Without friction, if you were to try and walk, you would slip and slide. So if I have my leg back and I'm ready to push off to continue my walk, then the pushing off motion from my toes, the intended motion is backwards because I'm trying to push against the ground away from my body. So in that case, there's going to be a friction force pointing in the forward direction. And because of that, it is the sole provider of my forward thrust. So that's very important to remember when looking at walking. Next, jumping is pretty much projectile motion. It's motion in 2D. If you're jumping, you're going from here to here. But the most important thing is that if you are jumping from one place to another, all of your calculations will have to be based on the center of mass of your living body, or the living organism. So make sure you always use that frame of reference, the center of mass, to calculate all relative positions for your projectile movement. The other most important thing about jumping is that when I'm jumping, I'm not just pushing on the ground with the weight of my body. I'm pushing on the ground with the force of my muscles, because I'm contracting my muscles and then expanding them very quickly in order to jump. So the act of jumping, if you are trying to figure out some force calculations, especially friction, the act of jumping requires a launching force where your feet push on the ground more than they usually do, because it's the force of the push plus the weight of your body. And finally, us humans do not propel, but snakes and worms do. So in terms of animals that do not have as many limbs as we do, essentially those that have less bone, they have to use other means of travel. So in order for them to move forward, they're going to have to leverage lateral and friction forces to create a forward thrust. To generate a forward thrust from lateral forces, they would use undulations, or basically the creation of transverse waves that go throughout their body in order for them to move. And then if they choose to use friction forces, then they're exhibiting something called rectilinear motion. Essentially what's happening here is that, let's use the snake as an example. The snake, which has a very long body, plants its head due to friction on the ground, and then it contracts all of its remaining body parts or remaining length. It tries and compresses it and contracts it so that it's very, very close to the head. Afterwards, it shifts its weight to the back of the body near its tail, and then the rest of the forward-facing part of its body gets launched forwards. But it can't launch forwards without friction. So with friction, the snake's tail will be able to stay where it is on the ground so that the front part of its body can launch forward. Afterwards, we talked about locomotion in air. And one of the best examples when we're looking at flight in living organisms is with birds and their wings. So obviously insects have wings as well, but they're very, very flat. You also have bats who also have very flat wings. But birds, they have feathers and they have more of a cambered profile, just like an airplane. So in this case, you have wind in green attacking the wing at a certain angle of attack, and that angle of attack is alpha. That wind, which is hitting the wing straight on, provides a drag force D. So that drag force is the friction force that's in air. It's the retarding force that prevents the object from moving forwards. So because of that, there has to be a counteracting force, and that is called a forward thrust force. So usually that's done by some propulsion mechanism. So in airplanes, that would be a propeller. So just remember that thrust will always try and combat a drag force. Now we take a look at what else prevents an object from flying. If I were a bird, or if we were birds and we were flying, then we would know that we at least have some sort of mass. And because of that mass, we're going to have weight. And that weight is going to drag us down. So there has to be a lifting force or a lift force that allows us to either glide or fly. So that lift force will act opposite to the direction of your weight. Now with those two forces, your thrust and your lift force providing the ability for you to fly, we can combine two different forces together to get a third type of force called the aerodynamic force. So the aerodynamic force is essentially a force that's generated by wind. It's the resultant of the lifting force, which is created by wind, and the drag force, which is created by wind. So at the very end, you have an aerodynamic wind force that is the resultant of those two vectors. A brief comment to mention would be that the drag force D is going to increase with your attack angle. So as your attack angle increases, so if your wing is like this, then your attack angle is just this. It's how far it rotates. The greater your attack angle, the more the wind is going to create a drag force, and the worse it gets for flying. So at some point though, whether it's here or here, completely perpendicular, at some point it reaches a certain maximum angle, and then your drag force decreases. So it kind of plateaus at a certain angle. But we won't focus on that in this course. Those would probably be best left for courses that completely focus on aerodynamics. So apart from just the general idea of what forces wind can provide, we also have to take a look at turbulence. Some of the equations we presented before included an equation for lift and an equation for drag. Because lift is a vertical force and drag is a horizontal force, if I ever want to figure out my aerodynamic efficiency, I divide the vertical component of lift and the horizontal by the horizontal component of drag. So that's just the efficiency of the system. Now, in terms of turbulence and airflow, there are two types of airflow we need to consider. There's streamlined or smooth airflow, and there's turbulent airflow. And Reynolds number is going to help us determine what kind of airflow we have. If your Reynolds number is greater than or equal to 1,000, then we consider airflow to be turbulent. And in that case, the living organism experiencing this turbulent airflow is going to have to compensate for it somehow. So back then in lecture 2, we had mentioned examples of butterflies. They actually have a Reynolds number really close to 1,000, but they have very flat wings, which helps to combat the turbulent airflow. With birds, like doves, they have Reynolds numbers of way over 1,000, and so they have to adjust their bodies to allow for a better aerodynamic efficiency. So that would be the smoothness of their wings to allow them to be able to maneuver in turbulent airflow. We also took a look at locomotion in water. So with this, what's happening is we've tried to simplify all the objects in water into a sphere. So I had that Whalmer Pokemon as an example. And when we take a look at a sphere moving in fluid, we can apply Stokes' law. And Stokes' law allows us to figure out what the viscous force is. And that's 6 pi times the viscosity of the medium times the radius of the sphere times the velocity that it's moving at. Now, times the velocity of the water. Apart from that equation, there was one more that we presented that is actually quite important, and it really depends on whether you're looking at a small species or a large species. So if you think about it, a small object in water might be able to just stay where it is without much effort, but a larger body in water means that it's going to have more mass and more weight. So in that sense, larger species will require additional lift force. And that lift force is going to be equal to this equation over here. So I won't go through it again, but it would be good to know that equation, or at least explain why a lift force is required in some cases. Apart from that, whether you have a small species or a large species, all living organisms that are in water are going to experience friction from water. So there's two types of friction forces, essentially. There is a surface drag, and that's going to be the friction of the medium across your skin. And then there's going to be a pressure drag, and that pressure drag is really just the retarding force of the flow of water against the front of your body. So that's the pressure drag. So let's now start with fluid flow. We can start discussing fluid dynamics. The first thing we want to do is go through essentially what is fluid flow and how is viscosity defined. Afterwards, we'll be able to figure out what kinds of fluid flow we can expect, which is turbulent versus laminar. We can then take a look at the different coefficients of viscosity that might give us some insight into whether we have laminar or turbulent flow. And then we're going to go through some temperature dependence of viscosity, as well as what a Newtonian fluid is. So first of all, what is, how do we characterize a fluid? A fluid is basically something that moves when a force is applied. So in this case, it could be a shearing stress, where it's like a pushing force. A part of it is going to gain velocity while the other opposes it. So that would be a characteristic of a fluid. Another thing to remember is that internal friction acts between different parts of the fluid. So what's happening is it's going to transfer momentum from faster to slower parts of your flow to try and equalize your velocity or to try and achieve equilibrium. And so this is called viscosity. Viscosity is essentially a measure of how much effort is required in order to move two layers of a fluid. So the more viscous a fluid is, the harder it is to get it to move. So then the next question is, now that we kind of get what a fluid is and viscosity, what happens when a fluid flows in a pipe? So when a fluid flows in a pipe, you usually end up with some velocity profile like this. So this is called a velocity profile. And that velocity profile does tell us a little bit about what's happening. It seems like fluid flow is slower at the edges of the pipe versus the center of the pipe. And it does make sense because at the edges of the pipe, there's going to be additional internal forces that are slowing the water down. Whereas in the center, it's just interactions between different molecules. So there's actually a much more detailed diagram that we'll go through afterwards for fluid flow and a velocity profile, but that's the general idea. All of your fluid is funneled into your channel, and then eventually it reaches a fully developed velocity profile, which is what I showed before. So just as we expected with the diagram previously, when fluid flows in a pipe, you'll notice that the flow velocity is the greatest along the central axis of the pipe, and you'll notice that the fluid flow is the slowest and the lowest at the wall of the pipe. And why? The particular force that causes this is called molecular adhesion forces between a fluid and a solid. So just remember what kind of forces are going to cause any slowing down of fluid. So now, can we actually model biological systems using fluid flow? What are some examples? We'll take a look at that next. So I have 3 examples here for biological systems and where we can actually apply fluid dynamics quite frequently. So number 1, which is what we're going to go through today in this lecture, is blood flow in the circulatory system. So obviously our blood flows inside a bunch of tubes inside our body, very, very small tubes or arteries that eventually become even smaller tubes or capillaries. But we can model blood flow based on the cylindrical model of fluids that we'll be going through in our foundations. In the next lecture, we're going to go through plant transport. So basically xylem and phloem transport or water flow in plants. And so that's the next picture over here. Apart from that, air is almost like a fluid, and our respiratory system is made up of a bunch of pipes. So starting with the windpipe, we can try and model airflow within our bodies as well. Now, in terms of fluid flow, there are 2 main types that we have to be aware of. There's laminar and there's turbulent. And once again, very similar to our discussion with Reynolds number in the previous lecture, there's also a Reynolds number here. So the higher the Reynolds number, the more turbulent and the more chaotic your flow. You always want a low Reynolds number to have steady laminar flow. So if you take a look at these 2 diagrams, it seems like as your object is approaching, as your object moves through the fluid, in laminar flow, there's a strong effort for each lamina or layer of fluid to try and return to normal after it gets disturbed. But if you have turbulent flow and you introduce an external object like this sphere, it won't be able to return to its original state. You'll see that it gets quite chaotic in this region. So we'll call this chaotic behavior. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at each type of flow. What is laminar flow? Laminar flow is essentially a steady type of flow. It can be visualized as different layers or planes of fluid molecules moving parallel to each other, exactly like this diagram. Every particle is going to follow a smooth path, and neighboring layers will pass by each other very smoothly with very little friction. This is also called streamline or viscous flow. Now, what is turbulent flow? Turbulent flow is going to be characterized by, number one, the irregular movement of particles. So you no longer have smooth lines across the entire image. You have chaotic behavior that kind of ends and doesn't really start again on the other side. So in this case, if I take a look here, because there's turbulent or chaotic flow, it means that it's highly possible for a mixture to occur. So mixing between the layers is very possible, and we call that lateral mixing. So you can kind of see some of the layers are now below and above where they were before with respect to other layers. So typical examples of turbulent flow would be recirculation, eddies, and just random motion. So anything with no consistent velocity would be considered turbulent flow. Now we take a look at how we can define viscosity and be able to determine whether something is viscous or not. And we have to look at something called the coefficient of viscosity. So if we consider steady laminar flow on a stationary solid surface like this, so I have my solid surface in green, and I have my velocity profile. So essentially here I have a velocity profile that's going like this. So there's my velocity profile. And for every line, there is a fluid layer with a surface area of A. And there's going to be a force that's required to move a fluid layer a distance y away from the surface with a velocity of v. So depending on which fluid layer you're looking at, so let's take a look at this blue fluid layer over here. It's a certain distance away from the solid surface, and based on that distance away from the solid surface, a specific amount of force will be required in order to move it. So you have this being the coefficient of viscosity, you have A being the surface area, and you have delta V over delta Y being what's called the velocity gradient. So that's a very important equation to know, because it'll allow you to calculate the coefficient of viscosity. Now, what exactly is this coefficient? It's a quantitative measure of fluid viscosity. So the greater the viscosity, the greater the force required to move it. And that does make sense. It refers to dynamic viscosity because we are trying to move something versus just look at how viscous it is sitting still. And it's measured in units of poise, or P. So 1 P is equal to a dyne times second divided by centimeters squared. 10 P is actually equal to 1 Pascal times 1 second, or Newton second per meter squared. So just be aware that in a lot of different textbooks or even research articles, they will be using units of poise to represent different terms in fluid dynamics. Now, because we're looking at fluid flow, we have to take a look at kinematic viscosity V. And that gives the rate at which velocity equalizes during laminar fluid flow. So it's almost like a kind of diffusion coefficient for velocity. So V is defined as your viscosity divided by your density rho. So now that we kind of know what a coefficient of viscosity is, we'll be able to figure out, or at least present you with different types of coefficients. So depending on what kind of sample or material you're looking at, you'll have a different fluid viscosity or coefficient of viscosity. So hydrogen, very, very low. Air, also very low. Water, it's on a scale of 10 to the -3 for a coefficient of viscosity. You have glycerine, which is 0.35. Very important to know that the coefficient of viscosity is different for different parts of your blood. So whole blood actually has 3 to 4 times 10 to the -3 as a coefficient of viscosity, whereas blood plasma has approximately 1.4 times 10 to the -3. So both very similar, but one is higher than the other, and we'll take a look at that afterwards. And it's primarily because of what blood is composed of. So what do we notice about water versus air? We notice that dynamic viscosity, which is eta, for water is higher than air. Kinematic viscosity for water is actually lower than air. So why is this? It's because water is more viscous than air, but airflow can actually attain equilibrium faster, so it has a much higher kinematic viscosity than water. Now, what is viscosity dependent upon? One of them is going to be temperature. So we want to be able to figure out how viscosity will change depending on whether you increase or decrease temperature. In this case, the viscosity of liquids will decrease with increasing temperature. And what this means is for liquids, neighboring molecules are going to interact with each other so that when the temperature increases, the movement of those molecules are going to become faster, easier, smoother, and most importantly, because of that faster movement, there's actually less intermolecular friction force. And so that means that the viscosity of liquids is going to decrease. It's going to be easier to move as you increase temperature for fluids. So thinking about it, it does make sense because as we increase the temperature of any type of liquid that we look at, of course there's exceptions, then usually they become more runny or less viscous. So in terms of organic liquids, the viscosity will decrease exponentially according to this equation over here, or this proportionality, where it's approximately proportional to e to the power of negative e over RT. E is the activation energy per mole, and A and B are going to be constants. So this is something that we won't be testing you on, but it is good to know that for organic liquids, the viscosity will decrease exponentially based on proportionality statements. So now that we know that the viscosity of liquids will decrease with increasing temperature, why don't we compare that with gases? And the thing is, we experience the exact opposite. The viscosity of gases actually increases with increasing temperature. And it's quite unique because in gas, your gas molecules are not going to interact with each other very frequently. They only interact once in a while through rare collisions. So they're not always rubbing against each other like in a fluid where all the molecules are really right beside each other. They're far apart and they're spacious. So at higher temperatures, what's happening is, according to kinetic theory, there's going to be more frequent collisions and therefore more internal interactions. Because there's a higher frequency of collisions and more interactions, that means that there are going to be a stronger amount or a larger amount of intermolecular friction forces, which actually means your viscosity will increase because it'll get harder for it to move. For real gases, though, viscosity will decrease faster than the square root of T with a temperature decrease. So here's another proportionality statement. According to the kinetic theory, we'll be able to say that the viscosity of gases is equal to the speed of the gas multiplied by the mean free path of the molecule multiplied by the density of your gas divided by 3. That means that I can essentially say that your viscosity is proportional to the speed of your gases, which is equal to approximately the square root of 3 RT over m. So we'll talk about that later once we move on to several chapters about gas. So looking at what we've covered so far, we know that there's laminar versus turbulent flow, but we never really talked about Newtonian versus non-Newtonian fluids. We talked about the flow itself, but we never characterized our fluid. So in order to characterize a fluid that's exhibiting motion, we have to consider two types. Either it's Newtonian or it's not. So in an ideal case, which is what we'll start off with, viscosity is going to be a constant at a given temperature. But in reality, viscosity really depends on the velocity of the flow. So what we're looking at here is your shear rate and your shear stress. And that's going to tell us whether you have a Newtonian fluid or a non-Newtonian fluid. So let's start off with a Newtonian fluid. It's basically a fluid for which viscosity can be taken as a constant at a given temperature during laminar flow. What it does is it follows Newton's law of viscosity, which we'll define in a bit. To be honest, no real fluid is going to fit this perfectly, but when we're doing modeling, then for sure we can assume that it's a Newtonian fluid. Common liquids gases like water and air are probably the most perfect in terms of whether they're close to a Newtonian fluid or not. So in many instances, we assume water and air to just be Newtonian. Now, a non-Newtonian fluid, simple definition, it's a fluid that doesn't follow Newton's law of viscosity. So in other words, it's a fluid for which viscosity is a function of velocity. So pretty much every fluid in real life is going to be, every fluid in real life, its viscosity is going to be dependent on its velocity. So if you do have a case of that, then you have a non-Newtonian fluid. And depending on how its viscosity changes due to velocity, you get different subclasses or classifications of non-Newtonian fluids as well. So some examples are blood, paint, and toothpaste. And it would be good to try and figure out what kind of non-Newtonian fluid they would be. So if we were to put all of this on a graph, we can try to graph non-Newtonian fluids. We know that a Newtonian fluid follows Newton's law of viscosity. So another way to express this, I'll just write down Newton's law of viscosity. Basically, it states that the fluid has a constant viscosity independent of stress. So that is the definition for Newton's law of viscosity. Be good to remember it just so that you can separate the difference between, determine the difference between Newtonian and non-Newtonian fluids. But we should probably try and graph it. So to start off, the viscosity of a fluid is going to be dependent on something called its shear rate. and the shear rate is how fast. Let me just. The shear rate is essentially its velocity. So how fast one layer of fluid passes over another. So we use this as our x-axis, which is the velocity, in other words. Then on the y-axis, you have a shear stress to represent how much shearing stress there is as a function of the shear rate. For a Newtonian fluid, the viscosity is constant, so you can kind of see it here for a Newtonian fluid. So you see a linear curve, which means everything is constant, irrespective of what the shear stress is. It's always going to be linear. But there are also several non-Newtonian fluids, and I don't really want to talk about the Bingham plastic and pseudoplastic. I just want to talk about the dilatant and the pseudoplastic categories here. So these two would be important to know about. Dilatant fluids traditionally have increasing velocity with increased stress. So these would be like cornstarch in water. As you're stirring something faster and faster, it's going to get more and more viscous. So that is a dilatant non-Newtonian fluid. Then you have a pseudoplastic fluid, which has decreasing viscosity with increased stress. So examples would be whipped cream. As you try and stir it faster and faster, it's going to get more and more liquidy. Molasses and syrup are examples of pseudoplastics as well. So might be a good exercise to take a look at everyday fluids like paint, cornstarch, soap, and see what kind of classification it falls under. So let's now go through some foundations of fluid flow. We have several equations that we have to present. So one of them is Poisseuille's formula. We have to go through velocity profiles in a little bit more detail now. We can present something called the continuity equation so that we can figure out if we change the size of the pipe, then what will the speed be based on the cross-sectional area. We'll then take a look at flow network and equivalent resistance. So that's like an analogy that we'll present. Then Bernoulli's equation and turbulence in fluids. So for Poisseuille's formula, the first thing we want to do is consider a laminar flow of fluid through some uniform cylindrical tube. So for steady flow, you're going to have a pressure difference to counteract the friction between the tube and the fluid. And Poisseuille's formula helps you represent that. So we use Poisseuille's formula to calculate the volume flow rate throughout the tube. We say delta V is the volume discharge, or the current, or amount of fluid moving per unit of time. We say delta P is the pressure difference between the two ends of the tube. We say L is equal to length, and R is the radius of the tube's cross-section. Then we have, of course, eta as fluid viscosity. Now, Poisseuille's formula is analogous to Ohm's law for electrical circuits. R is equal to the resistance of pipe to the flow. So essentially sorry, part of it's cut off here, but what we want to do is just present an analogy to Ohm's law. With Poisseuille's law, we have delta V equals to delta P over R. Delta V is considered some sort of flow per unit time, which can be considered a current, or I. We have delta P, which is a pressure difference between two ends of a tube. If we look at an electric circuit, we have a voltage difference between two ends of a tube, so we can make an analogy to delta V. And of course, you have the radius of, you have R being the resistance of the pipe to the flow, and that's represented by that equation here, 8 eta L divided by pi r to the 4. And you can now have a full analogy to Ohm's law in electricity and magnetism. So looking at the velocity profile in a little bit more detail, we call this a parabolic velocity profile. This means that there's steady fluid flow in a pipe to determine its velocity. As we discussed before, the velocity is maximum at the middle, and it's going to be 0 at the wall. So that's usually our definition of a parabolic velocity profile. And so over here, you have x as the distance to the center of the pipe, so basically the radius, and you have 2r representing the complete diameter of your tube. So if I were to calculate the velocity of fluid flow at any specific layer of fluid, I would use this equation and say V is equal to delta P over 4 eta L times r squared minus x squared. And you can also say that at the in order to have a maximum velocity, you're going to have x equals 0, because x is the distance away from the central axis. If you're 0 away from the central axis, then that term essentially goes to 0, and you just get this as your maximum velocity. So this equation, just by looking at it, tells us that the farther away we are from the central axis of the tube, the larger this value gets, and the smaller your velocity will be. Now, taking a look at the velocity profile diagram that we presented before, I'm going to go through a step-by-step explanation of this now. A velocity profile isn't going to be achieved right away. It's not like a fluid enters a tube and immediately achieves this perfect parabolic shape. There is a hydrodynamic entrance region that we call the first part of this, and this is where the fluid enters the channel. After it enters the channel, you'll see that the effect of surface friction is going to slow down the fluid flow on the edges of the wall. And then this effect slowly grows until you get a fully developed velocity profile that will remain the same for the rest of the cylindrical tube until it changes shape again. So because of that velocity profile, after it enters a specific tube of a certain length and a certain cross-sectional area, we have to consider what happens when the size of the tube changes. And in that case, this is where the continuity equation comes in. So we're going to consider again fluid flow through a pipe. We're going to assume something called continuous flow, and that means that there's no leakage in the pipe. All of the fluid is going to get shuffled through the next section of tube. So blood can be modeled as a continuous flow across a network of blood vessels because there's no leakages, and an equal amount of blood is going to come in and an equal amount of blood is going to come out. So for an incompressible fluid, we can apply the continuity equation. In that case, we have A1B1 is equal to A2V2. The cross-sectional area of your first tube, so in that drawing over here, this is like stage 1, and then you have stage 2 over here. So in the first section of the tube, which is obviously much wider, you have a larger cross-sectional area, and you have the velocity of fluid flow. Then what's going to happen when you shrink the cross-sectional area in the latter half of the tube? When you shrink the cross-sectional area, then because you still have the same amount of fluid, in order to compensate, the velocity is going to have to increase. So for smaller tubes, you're going to have larger velocities. Now, because we've defined fluid flow with cross-sectional area A and V, we call AV the volume rate of flow across an area A of pipe. So that's just the term for AV. Now, going through Poisseuille's equation and Poisseuille's formula again, remember a couple of slides ago we said that Poisseuille's formula was very comparable to Ohm's law. It's because of that, we can also kind of expand our analogy and move on to resistance formulas. So both of them describe the flow of the substance, whether it's fluid or charge, under potential gradients through a rigid pipe or wire. So resistance works in a similar fashion, whether it's in series or parallel. So we know that resistance, at least from what we presented, is equal to this equation in red, and that delta Q is equal to delta P over R. Then we'll be able to take a look at calculating series resistance and parallel resistance in the exact same manner as we do for circuits. So let's now take a look at some flow energetics in Bernoulli's equation. Something we need to consider is that when fluids are moving, they can contain both kinetic and potential energy. So in terms of that, potential energy is going to come from the work done by two sources, the pressure gradient and gravity. Kinetic energy, meanwhile, is going to come from the net work done on the system and the resulting fluid movement. So just remember where those different types of energies are going to come from. Viscosity is considered non-conservative, so there's actually energy dissipation during flow. If we disregard viscosity, we can actually apply the law of conservation of energy, where the kinetic energy plus the potential energy will be equal to constant. And here I presented Ke and Pe as Ek and Ep, just because it's another way of representing it if you prefer that method. Applying a lack of viscosity to steady laminar flow for incompressible fluids, we're able to get Bernoulli's equation. And Bernoulli's equation will be P plus 1/2 rho v squared plus rho gy, and that's equal to a constant. So let's just take a look at what each of these mean. P is actually the pressure of the fluid element, which dimensionally gives a measure of work done by external pressure. You have your kinetic energy element, which is 1/2 rho v squared. That's the kinetic energy of fluid element of a certain unit volume moving with a velocity of v. And finally, you have something very similar to mgh, which is gravitational potential energy of the fluid element at a height of y. So you have the density times gravity times the height y. Next, we're going to take a look at turbulence in fluids. We have laminar flow. It's ordered, smooth, and it's a silent, steady flow. The velocity is proportional to a pressure gradient. At very high velocities, though, we usually do have turbulent flow. So that's usually characterized by disordered, irregular paths. The velocity at any point is going to vary erratically. In a pipe, an average velocity for a turbulent flow is constant for most of the cross-sectional area, except for the pipe surface. And the average velocity is going to be proportional to the square root of pressure of the pressure gradient. So what this is saying is if you do have turbulence in fluids and if you have turbulent flow, you can calculate the average velocity using this equation, where c is some kind of constant. You have r divided by the density of the medium, and L times delta P. But most importantly, we can use that equation for something else, and that's to calculate the Reynolds number for fluids. So what kind of factors define when the flow becomes turbulent? Very similar to airflow, we can use Reynolds number to determine not the viscosity, but the how turbulent your fluid flow is. So in terms of what factors are going to define this, it's the velocity, the density of your fluid, the viscosity of your fluid, as well as the radius of your pipe. These factors can be quantified through what's called Reynolds number for fluids. And with airflow, anything above 1000 is turbulent, but for fluid flow, anything above 1700 is turbulent. So just keep in mind those slight differences between the two. And of course, the equation for Reynolds number is a little bit different. You can just take a look at the red equation there. Essentially, you start off with Reynolds number being 2r rho v over eta, but we know that delta v is equal to the change in volume is equal to pi r squared times v. And so combining that together, we get pi r times the Reynolds number times eta divided by 2 rho. So we've replaced v with a rearrangement of the first equation. So say rearrange for v and replace. So once you have that, you'll be able to solve for the Reynolds number, and you get 2 rho over pi r eta times delta v. So with all the foundations covered, we can finally go through hemodynamics, which is the dynamics of blood flow. First, I do have to go through the circulatory system and just the basics of blood circulation. And once we know that, we'll be able to see how we can model blood flow using the equations that we've covered. And of course, the last part of our discussion is really about what happens in real life. So in real life, blood is not perfectly flowing in a tube that's a perfect cylinder. There are many factors that we have to consider. One of them is the Fahraeus-Lindqvist effect. The other is plasma skimming. And then we have to take a look at some pressure flow relations in blood. I also have 3 practice problems that you can go through as well. So first, let's go through an overview of hemodynamics. Hemodynamics is the study of blood flow in arterial to venous circulatory systems. Blood is considered the viscous fluid in our pipelines. Just keep in mind those pipelines aren't perfect, but in order to do calculations with them, we're going to model them as pipelines. Your blood is composed of cells and plasma. It's not just, fluid. And remember, we had different coefficients of viscosity for plasma and blood earlier in the lecture. The viscosity of plasma is actually 1.8 times the viscosity of water, but the viscosity of whole blood is 3 to 4 times the viscosity of water. And that makes sense because there are red blood cells or erythrocytes that create additional internal friction within the blood. But if you take out all those blood cells, then the plasma remains, and that is closer to water. Now, another term we should know is hematocrit. That's the percentage of cells in your blood volume. So usually it's 42% cells and 58% plasma. So you can kind of see that depending on your hematocrit levels, your blood flow and your viscosity will change. So if we ask you what happens if you have an increase in hematocrit, then most likely your viscosity is going to increase because there's a higher percentage of cells in your blood volume, creating additional internal friction. Now let's go through a brief overview of the circulatory system. I won't really go through the slide too much because it's not as important, but the key thing is that your blood circulates throughout the body. It carries nutrients and oxygen everywhere in the circulatory, or also called the cardiovascular system. It also carries away waste products for removal. The cardiovascular system is an organ system that allows your blood to circulate throughout your body for nourishment and also to help prevent disease. It also plays a big role in homeostasis because it allows you to regulate your body temperature and pH through the circulation of hormones and blood cells. A key thing to know about the circulatory system is that it's broken down into two systems. There's the blood circulatory system and there's the lymph circulatory system. For the purposes of this lecture, we're only sticking with the blood circulatory system. So in terms of blood composition and circulation, blood is made up of blood vessels. And there are two main types of blood vessels. There's arteries and there's veins. With arteries, so here, arteries are represented in red over here. They move blood away from the heart. So they move blood away from the heart, and the veins move blood back towards the heart. Looking at this diagram here, I have the left side of the heart in red. If I'm trying to look at what's happening in terms of circulation of blood from the heart to the body and back, I take a look at this diagram and everything starts from the left atrium. There's going to be blood that comes out, goes through a bunch of arteries. So oxygenated blood is pumped from the left atrium to the left ventricle, then to the body. Let me just get the laser pointer. So we have oxygenated blood here. It's pumped from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it goes out to the aorta and then to your arteries, which are oxygenated. Those arteries then get split up into a bunch of arterioles, and those arterioles then get split up into your capillaries. After your body, different organs use up the oxygen or the nutrients that the blood carries to it, then the blood becomes deoxygenated, so it's now blue, and it goes back up into the right atrium. And then it goes into the right ventricle and exits to go to the lungs to get reoxygenated through air exchange. So we'll talk about air exchange in the next topic for gas, but let's just assume the blood is now oxygenated and it returns to the left atrium to get pumped throughout the body again. Now, another way of looking at this is what happens if you're going from the heart to the lungs and back. Just some key terms. If we are looking here, there's a pulmonary artery over here that carries deoxygenated blood to the lungs. It goes to the alveoli, goes through air exchange, and then it goes through pulmonary veins, oxygenated, back to the heart. So while it's in the lungs, all you need to know for now is that the blood gets rid of carbon dioxide and picks up more oxygen. Now, a key thing to note is that there can be isolated circulatory systems as well, depending on your organ system. So we call those portal systems. Portal systems are those systems that carry blood to specific parts of your body. So for example, the hepatic portal system is going to carry nutrient-rich blood from the digestive system to your liver. So that's just something very specific, but there are several cases of that within your body. So in terms of your blood vessels, you actually have a huge network of blood vessels within your body. Your arteries and veins are the thickest blood vessels, but as they circulate blood around your body, they have to branch out. So taking a look at, let's see, an artery. An artery branches out into arterioles, and then eventually they become capillaries. And then those capillaries are going to feed into venules and then into veins. So you can kind of note that an arteriole has a diameter of that, a cross-sectional area of this, whereas capillaries, there are a bunch of channels. So they have various shapes and sizes, but all of them are very small. for the purposes of modeling, we're just going to assume all of the capillaries have a uniform disc size or cross-sectional area, so that we'll be able to make predictions based on that. So even though we can model blood flow as typical laminar flow, it's not perfect. So blood flow in narrow vessels actually show less viscosity than larger vessels. So that's something unique that you wouldn't see in just water flowing through a few pipes. In this case, we're experiencing something called the Fahraeus-Lindqvist effect. I don't know how to pronounce that. But for capillaries that are smaller than 1 millimeter in diameter, they are so tiny that essentially all of your red blood cells flow or fall into one line. And then your blood viscosity becomes very close to plasma viscosity, because there's only so much movement that's allowed in a very small capillary. This effect is due to the alignment of red blood cells in narrow vessels. So you can kind of see how all of them are more like disordered over here, and eventually they line up and flow in a small tube. So although blood flow is mostly laminar, turbulence occurs, and if there is any obstruction in the vessel or sharp turn, then there is going to be a turbulence effect. You might be asked, or you might be interested in knowing, where is blood flow turbulent? It's most turbulent in the aorta and also in the pulmonary artery, because those are where the blood vessels are the largest, and that gives room for more disorder in terms of where those blood vessels can go. And also, if you branch off into the arterial tree, then you'll also see some turbulence, because there is still room for multiple blood cells to move within the vessel. We'll be taking a look at this later on, but we can actually use sound to indicate where there's turbulent flow. And if there is turbulent flow, that usually indicates that there might be, let's say, a blood clot somewhere, because there's an obstruction in that blood vessel. Okay, so let's talk about plasma skimming. This is another effect that can be seen in real life. Essentially what, I'll try my best to explain it. Basically, blood flow is laminar, so we can assume a regular velocity profile, a parabolic velocity profile. So if I draw over here, do it in green, let's say we have a typical parabolic velocity profile over here, which means the speed of plasma in this case is going to be the greatest in the center, or at the central axis. Now, because of the greater amount of speed, one of the things about blood is that it isn't just made up of plasma, it's also made up of red blood cells and other things. So if you have higher speeds in the center, all of the cells are going to try and want to, focus or accumulate in the middle at a maximum velocity. In this case, it actually increases the viscosity of the blood in the center of your blood vessel. However, this also means that close to the walls, there's less blood vessels, so your viscosity actually decreases and the flow of blood is faster at the walls. In this case, what happens here is that when a blood vessel branches off in this direction, the density of your blood cell will decrease in secondary vessels, because all of your blood vessels are now accumulated in the center of your main blood vessel, but there's less on the outskirts, on the walls. So then a lower density of blood vessels will be able to travel for every branch that you have off of your main artery or arterial. So that's just what's called plasma skimming. You're taking a lower density of red blood cells and transferring it to further smaller blood vessels. Now, taking a look at pressure flow relations in blood, that's given by Poisseuille's formula, which we've represented as an analogy to Ohm's law. So delta V is equal to delta P over R. But we can also define R as vascular resistance. in laminar blood flow. Blood resistance in peripheral circulation is usually measured in PRUs, or peripheral resistance units. And it's actually the resistance with a flow of delta V equals to 1 milliliters per second and a pressure drop of 1 millimeter of mercury. So that's just a conversion equation that you can use if required. So with realistic cardiovascular blood flow, there are a couple other considerations we have to look at. It's quite different than steady laminar flow because of two main reasons. Number one, you do get pressure fluctuations in your actual blood vessels. The contraction of your heart ventricle is going to generate oscillations and pressure waves that dampen out the periphery, where it becomes almost steady. So essentially what's happening here is that your velocity profile might not be as parabolic as you would expect, especially when your ventricle is going to contract, or your heart is going to contract and push the blood out. So that's something to look at. Next, you have compliance. Blood vessels are not rigid, but they are distensible and they're slightly stretchy or elastic. And compliance depends on size and elasticity. The venous system is more compliant than the arterial because of a larger volume, and it acts as a blood reservoir. But once again, we'll be able to figure out compliance by getting the ratio of your voltage drop or divided by your pressure drop. Okay, so now on to some practice problems. Practice problem 3.1 really is just asking you to calculate the Reynolds number for a certain type of fluid. And then you should be able to also determine whether it's experiencing turbulent or steady flow, laminar flow. Practice problem number 2 asks you to determine the speed of blood flow in the capillaries. So it actually gives you a cross-sectional area of a capillary, gives you the number of capillaries, and it gives you the radius of the aorta. So you're trying to figure out the speed of blood flow in the capillaries. So you should be able to use one of the equations that we presented in the mathematical foundations portion and be able to apply it to a model of blood flow in blood vessels. Practice problem 3.3 is a little bit harder. It requires a bit of knowledge about Bernoulli's equation as well as blood flow. So it's related to an injection. A patient is to be given blood by a needle that's 3 centimeters long and has an inner radius of 0.25 millimeters. You're looking at blood flow into the needle, and you're also looking at steady flow from a bag or an IV bag above the body. So you're trying to figure out how high should the bottle or the bag be placed to achieve this steady flow. So finally, onto the summary. Some of the things that you should remember are the types of fluid flow. So know the differences between laminar and turbulent flow. Know the differences between a Newtonian and non-Newtonian fluid with some examples. Definitely know the equations for Poisseuille's formula and the continuity equation, as well as how to look at a velocity profile and explain it. I've forgotten one here, but you should definitely know about Bernoulli's equation as well. Then for hemodynamics, I would want you to at least understand a portion of the circulatory system as well as what blood is made of. Understand what kind of realistic effects blood actually experiences. So the Fahraeus-Lindqvist effect as well as plasma skimming, definitely know how to explain those. And then some realistic considerations of blood flow that we talked about before, like compliance.